Hey guys, tonight we're heading way back to ancient Greece, not to climb mountains or battle monsters, but to unravel one of mythology's softest, strangest tales. A story that features neither epic wars nor grand betrayals, but instead a goose, or possibly a swan. The ancient sources weren't great at bird ID. Yes, this is the surprisingly romantic, gently absurd myth of Zeus and Leda, a tale so dreamy and confusing that even ancient poets weren't sure whether it was supposed to be serious or satire. All we know for certain is that it involves transformation, eggs, a queen, and at least one very determined bird. You probably won't survive this, by the way, not because of any divine punishment or heroic battle, but because once Zeus starts turning into poultry to flirt, all logical structure begins to dissolve gracefully, like mist off a lake or a swan feather falling in slow motion. Hey guys, tonight we're heading way back to ancient Greece, not to climb mountains or battle monsters, but to unravel one of mythology's softest, strangest tales, a story that features neither epic wars nor grand betrayals, but instead a goose, or possibly a swan. The ancient sources weren't great at bird ID. Yes, this is the surprisingly romantic, gently absurd myth of Zeus and Leda, a tale so dreamy and confusing that even ancient poets weren't sure whether it was supposed to be serious or satire. All we know for certain is that it involves transformation, eggs, a queen, and at least one very determined bird. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. We begin in Sparta, not the spear rattling, Gerard Butler shouting version, but the quiet, olive grove lined Sparta of myth. Here, Queen Leda lives a calm, royal life with her husband Tyndareus, who, despite having a name that sounds like a thunder spell, is actually quite average. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Leda tends her palace gardens, oversees her handmaidens, feeds the birds. She is the kind of queen who prefers practical sandals over golden heels, and who secretly thinks the gods are a little too dramatic for their own good. But that never stopped the gods from paying attention to mortals, especially one particular god, the one who sits on Olympus throwing thunderbolts and compliments in equal measure, Zeus. You see, Zeus has a thing for mortal women, a reputation, really. And when he sees Leda from his cloudy throne one quiet morning, walking through a sunlit courtyard, probably humming something dignified, he feels something unexpected, a soft sort of admiration. Of course, being Zeus, he immediately ruins that by deciding to turn into a bird. This isn't one of his usual obsessions, full of chaos and lightning. This feels delicate, quiet, maybe even respectful. Now, here's where it gets complicated. Some versions say swan, others say goose. A few say something even more ambiguous like white waterfowl of noble bearing. But for our sleepy stroll tonight, we're choosing goose because it's funnier, gentler, and adds a lovely honking texture to the tale. He lands in Leda's garden just as the sun begins to dip. The queen is alone, tending her flowers, when she sees something white and shimmering at the edge of the pond. Down he goes, gliding softly toward the palace of Sparta, his goose heart fluttering with immortal nerves. So imagine Zeus, king of the gods, shape-shifting mid-cloud. Wings grow, feathers sprout. His thunderbolt is temporarily replaced by webbed feet. Somewhere, Apollo is probably rolling his eyes. A goose, elegant, serene, suspiciously majestic. She pauses. The goose tilts its head. She laughs. just once. And somewhere far above, Hera squints and says, "He sits doing what this time?" The goose doesn't speak, of course. That would be ridiculous, even for Zeus. Instead, he waddles closer, gracefully, as far as waddling goes, letting the late afternoon light catch on his shimmering feathers. There's something almost royal in the way he moves, like a bird who's very aware of the importance of posture. Leda watches from the garden bench, head tilted. She's not alarmed. This isn't the first strange visitor she's had in Sparta. She once received a bronze statue from Crete, shaped like a snail and filled with honey. She's had dream visions of Apollo trying to sell her cloud insurance. But a beautiful goose. This is new. She reaches out slowly, and the goose, Zeus in gentle disguise, leans into her hand. Warm, soft, he emits a small honk, possibly divine in nature. Now, you might be thinking, wait, is this the moment? Is this when the myth turns odd? Yes, but gently, because unlike most of Zeus's transformations, where he barrels into someone's life as a bull or golden rain or a questionably muscular eagle, this time he lingers. He doesn't rush. He nests, quite literally. Leda laughs again, softer this time, and strokes the goose's neck. Somewhere, Tyndareus is off consulting grain merchants, entirely unaware that his courtyard has become the stage for the strangest romance in Greek mythology. What happens next? Well, that depends on who's telling the story. Some say Leda dreams the whole thing, sees a goose land beside her in a dream meadow, speaks with a silver voice, leaves feathers behind. Others say Zeus waits until nightfall, then returns in human form, cloaked in moonlight and mystery, and Leda receives him willingly, or doesn't. Some versions are troubling, others oddly tender. Historians still argue whether this encounter is metaphor, allegory, celestial prank, or just an elaborate excuse for what comes next. The eggs, but we shall get to those later. For now, what matters is this. The moment was strange, yes, but also soft. A goose in a garden, a queen with tired hands, a silence filled only with ripples and featherlight intentions. And in that moment, the great king of Olympus, the thunder thrower, the god of law and sky, sat perfectly still, his head resting in a mortal woman's lap. Whether Leda knew who he was is another mystery entirely. Maybe she did. Maybe the glint in his eye gave him away. Maybe she dreamed of thunder that night. Maybe the breeze whispered his name across the columns of the palace. Or maybe she just liked birds. After all, she fed them every morning, had names for them, kept a list of which ones preferred barley over wheat. A goose like this, so serene, so unnaturally poised, might simply have struck her as unusual, but not unwelcome. The stars emerge above Sparta, crisp and bright, unbothered by the strange meeting below. Somewhere in Olympus, the other gods begin to notice Zeus's absence. Apollo raises an eyebrow. Athena doesn't even look up from her scrolls. And Hera, oh Hera, she taps her fingers on the arm of her throne and begins quietly assigning rainstorms to Laconia. But Leda sleeps peacefully that night. And in the courtyard, beneath the fig trees, a single white feather drifts slowly to the ground, catching the starlight like a secret. Morning in Sparta arrives with the usual chorus of waking birds and yawning servants, the sky already warming with that hazy gold particular to mythological landscapes. Leda stirs in her bed of woven linen and cedar oil, opens one eye and listens. Everything sounds normal, which is suspicious. There are no divine trumpets, No booming voice from the clouds announcing a change in fate. Just the quiet splash of water from the garden fountain and the low cooing of doves outside her window. She sits up slowly, stretches, and catches sight of something at the foot of her bed. A single white feather. Not a pillow feather, not dove-sized, something broader, more elegant, more goose adjacent. She blinks at it, considers, says nothing. Because sometimes, in mythology as in life, the best thing to do with a potentially divine feather in your bedroom is to pretend you don't see it until you've had breakfast. Meanwhile, up on Olympus, things are considerably less quiet. You're now floating, dreamlike, into the divine palace in the clouds, where the gods lounge on dramatically carved thrones and pretend not to eavesdrop on one another. Except today, they're all very interested in what Zeus has been doing. Where is he? Asks Hermes, chewing idly on a sprig of laurel. He never misses breakfast or opportunities to brag. He sat's been unusually quiet, muses Aphrodite, plucking petals from a rose and dropping them into her wine, which either means love or guilt. Hera doesn't say anything at first. She just pours herself more nectar, slowly, and stares into the middle distance, like someone calculating the trajectory of a thunderbolt. Apollo raises an eyebrow. He turned into something again, didn't sit he? There sits a general murmur of divine agreement. You, watching invisibly from your little sleepy corner of the clouds, float gently towards Zeus's throne, empty of course, but beside it, a single white feather, neatly placed, gleaming faintly. Even on Olympus, everyone knows what that means. Because this is not the first time Zeus has taken a peculiar shape in the name of love, or whatever emotion it is he's calling it this week. Historians and poets alike have tried to catalog his transformations. A bull, a shower of gold, an eagle, even a flame. But the goose, that one still gets side eyes in the divine record. Athena sighs deeply. Why not just send a gift basket, like a normal suitor? But this is Zeus, king of the gods, shapeshifter supreme. Logic is optional. Back on Earth, Leda carries on with her royal routine. She greets her husband, Tyndareus, who in classic myth fashion is delightfully oblivious. He notices nothing amiss. Not the lingering goose prints in the dust, not the new glint in his wife's eye, not the way the birds in the garden seem to be watching her with respect. Because in some versions of the story, Leda spends this day not just with Zeus, but also with Tyndareus, a double encounter, as the ancient texts like to phrase it, which is mythology speak for. Please don't ask how this timeline works. So yes, two visitors, one queen, one knight, and no, the ancient Greeks did not include a handy chart. Instead, they left behind poetry, long, sleepy, wildly contradictory poems that murmur through the centuries. A goose came to her, or a swan, or maybe a vision, and afterward, she laid an egg. Actually, two eggs. But that comes later. For now, Leda walks the palace halls, calm, composed, feather in her pocket. She says nothing. No one asks. And up in the clouds, Zeus reappears at last, back in his usual form, adjusting his laurel crown like nothing happened. Nice day, he says casually. The other gods stare. Aphrodite leans in. So, Zeus smiles, inscrutable. You had to be there. Hera narrows her eyes, and somewhere far below, in the heart of Leda's royal bedchamber, something begins to stir. Something oval, something glowing faintly. A few days pass. The garden geese return to their usual disinterested honking. The servants resume sweeping colonnades that are somehow always dusty, no matter how clean they look. And Leda is glowing in the very specific way that mortal women in myths glow when something weird is about to happen to their reproductive systems. She doesn't mention the feather, or the dreams, or the lingering warmth in her palms after petting what might have been a divinely disguised waterfowl. Instead, she goes about her business like nothing is unusual. Until, of course, it is. Because one morning, while inspecting the offerings brought by local farmers, dates, wine, rather lumpy statue of Artemis Leda feels an unmistakable tightness in her belly, not the food poisoning kind, the myth-making kind. And when she returns to her chambers and calls for her handmaidens, they find her seated on a low stool, calm as anything, cradling not one but two enormous eggs in her lap. No one speaks for a full minute. Finally, one servant clears her throat and asks the question that will echo through Greek mythology forever. My queen, did you lay those? Leda, to her credit, just smiles mysteriously. Because in Greek myth, weird births are practically a genre of their own. Athena popped out of Zeus's forehead in full armor. Dionysus was stitched into a thigh. Compared to that, a goose encounter, followed by two eggs, is practically understated. The eggs are placed gently in a gilded basket and tucked beneath layers of fine linen. No one quite knows what to do with them. The royal physician is consulted, squints at the shells, and declares that the gods sometimes work in poultry, then faints. The eggs are warm. They glow faintly in moonlight, and after a few more days, under a sky unusually filled with swans, geese, and one confused pigeon, they hatch. From the first egg emerge two children. Helen, luminous, radiant, future cause of the Trojan War, and Clytemnestra, fierce, sharp-eyed, future architect of royal revenge plots. From the second, Castor and Pollux, twin boys with matching dimples and the uncanny ability to wrestle wild animals before breakfast. Everyone is stunned. Tyndareus says nothing for several hours, then nods once, possibly out of love, possibly out of total resignation. He agrees to raise them all as his own. It's either noble, or he just knows arguing with divine eggs is a fool's errand. Historians still argue over the exact breakdown. Who came from which egg, which were mortal, which divine, and whether Zeus or Tyndareus was the technical father. Theories abound. None are sleep-friendly. Some versions say only Pollux was immortal. Others claim Helen was entirely divine, hatched fully perfect with a beauty rating of 10 out of 10 and hair that could summon ships. No one agrees, but everyone agrees the eggs were real. And if you're wondering what happened to the eggshells, one poet claimed they were preserved in a temple to Leda, hung from the rafters as sacred relics. Imagine going to offer thanks to the gods and standing under a divine omelet fragment. Meanwhile, up on Olympus, Zeus is smug. He watches the children grow with mild pride and extreme detachment, like a dad who sends birthday scrolls but doesn't attend the chariot races. Hera continues to glare at him over dinner. Apollo writes a ballad about the eggs that somehow gets banned in Athens for tone. And Leda? She returns to her routine, a little wiser, a little weirder, a mother to four children who will each become major players in myths that involve war, betrayal, resurrection, and in one case, synchronized horse taming. No one ever questions the goose story again. Because in a world where gods can become bulls, trees can talk, and heroes forget their entire destinies, every Tuesday, A love affair between a mortal queen and a feathered sky god is just another strange ripple in the endless pond of myth. And at the center of it all sits Leda, peaceful, poised, and entirely unbothered. She still visits the garden every morning, and sometimes, when the dew is fresh and the sun just right, a single white feather drifts softly to the ground at her feet. Now let's talk about those hatchlings, because once you've laid two divine eggs and gone about your day like that's perfectly reasonable, you're basically inviting fate to turn your family into a mythological soap opera. First, there's Helen. Yes, that Helen. Yes, that Helen. The one whose face will someday launch 1,000 ships, as poets keep insisting, even though that seems like an exhausting number of ships for one face. As a child, she's unreasonably radiant. People describe her glow as divine, ethereal, and slightly distracting during sacrificial ceremonies. Birds land near her just to be near the light. Shepherds lose track of their flocks because her hair shines too brightly in sunlight. This becomes a problem. Then there's Clytemnestra, her sister, who is not particularly radiant, but has opinions. She's sharp, clever, fond of knives, and famously not here to smile politely. Clytemnestra will one day marry Agamemnon, and then, well, let's just say the wedding ends better than the marriage. As for the twins, Castor and Pollux, they're delightful, nearly identical, constantly sparring and loyal to each other in that fierce mythological way that makes them the poster children for divine brotherhood. They ride horses like they were born in saddles, and they frequently rescue one another from situations that involve angry boars or overly ambitious wedding plans. The palace grows lively. Leda handles it all with the serene patience of someone who's seen too much and no longer flinches when her toddler lifts a chariot. Tyndareus, still mortally confused, but emotionally sturdy, throws himself into statecraft, hoping that diplomatic minutiae will distract him from the fact that two of his children may be partially immortal or birds. It's not clear. Meanwhile, the egg origin story begins to spread, not as scandal, but as legend. Priests whisper of it in temple courtyards. Bards begin to sing about it at festivals, softly at first, then louder once they realize people find it oddly soothing. And before long, Leda becomes something else entirely, not just queen, not just mother, but myth. Shrines begin to appear. Modest at first, a statue here, a mural there, always tasteful, always with just enough feathered symbolism to make you wonder. But here's where it gets interesting. Some versions of the story split. In certain tellings, Leda is visited only by Zeus. In others, she is also visited that same night by her mortal husband, Tyndareus. And depending on which version you prefer, different children belong to different fathers. This gives rise to a scholarly tradition that can only be described as the paternity flowchart from Tartarus. Ancient poets try to sort it out, often while sipping too much wine and arguing about metaphysical inheritance. Some say Pollux is divine, Castor mortal. Others flip it. Some say Helen is a daughter of Zeus. Others insist she's the child of Tyndareus, but gifted with divine grace. A few, more daring voices claim all four children came from both fathers, which raises questions about egg physics no one really wants to explore. Historians still argue about whether the dual father narrative was meant to unify different regional myths, or just a clever way of explaining why some siblings had lightning in their veins while others mostly had sarcasm. But Leda herself never clarifies. She never writes a scroll, never delivers a public statement. She simply smiles, enigmatic, featherlight, as if to say, what does it matter? Who fathered them? They sit her mind, and they are. As they grow, each child begins to fulfill their narrative destiny. Helen, with her doomed beauty, Clytemnestra, with her fire-forged resolve, Castor and Pollux, with their heroic twinship that will one day echo among the stars. You wonder, sometimes, what Leda thinks as she watches them become the stuff of epics. Does she remember the garden that day, the white feathers, the soft, improbable weight of the eggs? Does she feel pride, worry, or just a quiet awe that something so strange, so impossible, became? No one knows, because in the end, she says nothing. She just tends the palace, lights lamps, mends robes, listens as poets start arriving at the gates, asking to describe her story with metaphors she'll never read. She declines to speak, and instead lets the myth do the talking. Now that the eggs have hatched, and the children are causing small mythological ripples just by existing, you'd think the story might settle, perhaps taper off into noble parenting and soft focus family picnics by the Eurotas River. But no, because this is Zeus. And Zeus, as it turns out, never just transforms and disappears quietly. No, he lingers. Not physically. He's back on Olympus playing it cool, but in reputation, in implication, and in a series of increasingly peculiar follow-up transformations that make the goose look almost modest. Let's Dex take a moment to examine this trend, because the goose or swan, depending on your translation, is only one in a string of divine disguises. Zeus used to pursue his romantic, or let's be honest, often inappropriate interests. Let's recap the highlights of his mythical costume closet. There's the bull, famously used to whisk Europa across the sea to Crete. Not a regular bull, mind you, but a gleaming, impossibly beautiful one, like something out of a high-end livestock catalog. Europa climbs on. Zeus swims away with her on his back. No one stops him. There's the golden shower. And yes, that's exactly how it's usually translated. Zeus transforms into glittering droplets of divine gold to visit Dana, who had been inconveniently locked in a bronze prison to prevent her from having children. Spoiler, she has Perseus. There's the flame for Aegina, the eagle for Ganymede, the satyr for Antiope. At one point, he turns into Artemis herself to approach a nymph named Callisto, which opens up a whole other scroll of interpretive discomfort. So when Zeus chooses to become a goose, it almost feels restrained, polite even. Historians still argue whether the goose transformation was meant to be symbolic, representing grace, divinity, or perhaps a celestial presence that's non-threatening, or whether Zeus was just running out of forms and went with what was nearby. Some scholars lean toward the swan theory, noting that in classical poetry, swans often symbolized purity and poetic inspiration. Others say ancient Greek doesn't distinguish clearly between certain waterfowl, and that whatever bird Zeus was, it was white, floating, and unusually forward. There's also the logistical question. How does one seduce someone as a goose? The myths are vague. They skip the details. There's a great deal of poetic fluttering, mentions of wings and soft feathers, of divine visitation, and glorious light. You'll find very little practical explanation, and that, frankly, is a mercy. But what's important, at least for this sleepy telling, is that the goose form has stayed with us. Artists across the centuries have painted, sculpted, and frescoed this moment again and again. Leda reclining, the bird beside her, sometimes gentle, sometimes unnervingly intimate. And while the details vary, Swan or Goose, embrace or surprise, the story itself never quite fades. Zeus's choice to appear as a goose marks a rare moment in Greek myth, a softer transformation, less violent, less dramatic, more surreal. And maybe that sits why it lingers, because it feels like a dream, like something half remembered from a warm afternoon, like a strange visitor in the garden who left no words, only feathers. You can imagine Leda watching her children grow, hearing tales of Zeus's other escapades, and thinking, at least mine was a bird. At least no thunderbolts were thrown. At least the eggs were healthy. At least the kingdom didn't sink into the sea yet. There's something oddly comforting about that. The gods, with all their drama and fury, occasionally get it right. Or at least, they choose a disguise that doesn't destroy everything it touches. And in that quiet, strange choice, there's a story that feels almost gentle. Almost. Because the goose may have flown away. But the ripples it left behind, still circling. So the eggs have hatched. The children are thriving. And Zeus, ever the cosmic drop-in dad, has flapped off into the heavens once more, no longer cloaked in feathers. But before we float too far into mythological mist, it's time to zoom out and take a long, sleepy look at what those children actually did next. Because Helen, Clytemnestra, Castor, and Pollux didn't just go on to have average mortal lives. No quiet family picnics, no gentle aging beneath olive trees. Instead, they essentially became the entire supporting cast of every Greek tragedy ever written. Let's start with Helen, who, to be clear, is still glowing. People across Greece whisper about her beauty. She doesn't walk through a room so much as illuminate it. Her face doesn't just launch ships, it causes foreign kings to lose sleep, generals to change their battle plans, and poets to develop sudden, overly complicated metaphors. She marries Menelaus, the Spartan king. Things are peaceful. Then along comes a certain Trojan prince named Paris, and well, you know what happens. Was she kidnapped? Did she leave willingly? Did Aphrodite meddle? Historians and poets still argue whether Helen was victim, participant, or bored royalty swept up in divine mischief. What's certain is that her departure from Sparta led to the Trojan War, an entire epic about angry Greeks, wooden horses, and truly excessive helmet polishing. And where was Leda during all of this? Back in Sparta, probably pressing olives and wondering why people keep blaming the goose. Then there's Clytemnestra, Helen's sister, who is not radiant, but absolutely unforgettable. She marries Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces. While he's off fighting a 10-year war, she runs the kingdom. When he returns, fresh from sacrificing their daughter to appease the gods, she welcomes him home with a smile, a red carpet, and a murder plot. She kills him with an axe in the bathtub. Again, historians argue whether this was revenge, justice, or just a Tuesday for mythic royalty. Either way, Clytemnestra becomes a symbol of female rage, power, and deeply uncomfortable dinner parties. Meanwhile, Castor and Pollux, the divine mortal twins, go off having heroic adventures, taming horses, boxing giants, rescuing kidnapped brides. They're so close that when Castor, the mortal one, dies, Pollux, the immortal one, begs Zeus to let them share everything, including death and divinity. Zeus agrees. The brothers are turned into stars, the constellation Gemini, twinkling side by side for eternity, which, all things considered, is a pretty lovely ending for two boys hatched from a celestial egg carton. But what about Leda? Her name fades in these later stories. Her role becomes a footnote, mother of Helen, wife of Tyndareus, the one with the goose. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear her influence echoing through every line. Because none of these stories, Troy, revenge, divine starlight, happen without her. She is the hinge point, the quiet queen in the middle of it all, the one who receives the strange, glowing bird, the one who raises the children who shape the future. And through it all, she remains mysterious. Some versions say she was worshipped after death, given a small shrine, a statue, even a modest cult. Others say she faded into quiet old age, tending her garden and smiling wryly whenever someone brought her a gift shaped like a feather. There's no tragedy written about her. No hero sings her name in battle. And maybe that's the real myth, that a woman at the heart of so many legends remains still, composed, human, even when her children light up the sky and bring down cities, even when her name becomes shorthand for divine intrigue and poetic discomfort, even when people forget her story and only remember the bird. Because myths, like feathers, drift. They don't always land where they should. But Leda, she sits still there, quietly at the center. The queen who sat beneath a fig tree and didn't flinch when a goose walked up with destiny tucked beneath its wing. By now, the goose has flown, the eggs have hatched, and the children have more or less upended half the canon of Greek mythology. But there sits still one lingering question that refuses to be laid to rest. Was any of this real? Not in the did Zeus actually do this sense. We've already accepted that gods in mythology do a lot of things that stretch the limits of physics and propriety, but in the sense of what this myth actually meant to the Greeks. Because depending on which version you pick up, the entire story might not be literal at all. There's a long-standing scholarly debate, one that spans centuries and includes no fewer than 6 conflicting footnotes per page about whether the myth of Leda and the goose was a dream, a vision, a symbol, or simply an allegorical poem that spiraled wildly out of hand. Some ancient authors describe Leda waking up from a dream with feathers on her pillow and a strange warmth in her skin. Others hint that the divine bird came to her in her sleep as an image rather than a being. Some even frame the entire myth as an omen, a prophetic message disguised as a bedtime hallucination. Which raises the very cozy question, was the entire goose affair just a divinely sponsored nap? You can picture it. Leda, resting in the shade, head tilted, lulled by the murmur of the fountain and the hum of cicadas, only to wake with a strange clarity and the sudden urge to check under her bed for celestial poultry. In some tellings, she doesn't even see Zeus, only feels his presence, soft and overwhelming, like a memory that hasn't happened yet. She walks away with a vague sense of awe, a twinge of mystery, and eventually an egg or two. And that ambiguity, that dreamlike haze, it sits part of why the story lasted so long. Unlike other myths, which are full of sound and fury and extremely poor impulse control, Leda's tale is quiet. It unfolds in soft light. There are no battles, no curses, no screams, just a bird, a queen, and the gentle hum of something deeply strange happening in broad daylight. It's the kind of story that doesn't want to be explained, which makes poets very uncomfortable. For centuries, they've tried to decode it, to make it noble or tragic, or at the very least, understandable. But the more they write, the more slippery the meaning becomes. One poet called it divine ambiguity. Another described it as a metaphor for desire feathered in moonlight. A third gave up entirely and wrote 4 pages about eggs. Historians still argue whether the myth was originally about fertility, sovereignty, divine union, or cosmic miscommunication. Some say the goose represented Zeus's attempt to appear harmless. Others say it was a metaphor for a different kind of spiritual visitation, one that left the body untouched but the soul altered. And there's always the possibility that it was a joke, a divine prank, a poetic dare that got out of hand and became canon because no one wanted to admit they didn't get it. Even now, the myth of Leda and the goose or swan exists in this liminal space between reverence and giggle. It's beautiful, yes, but also absurd. It's intimate, but also distant, sacred, but lightly ridiculous. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the story has lasted not because it makes sense, but because it doesn't. Because it gives us a glimpse into a world where gods appear as birds, women become legends by napping in the sun, and meaning isn't always meant to be found, just felt. So whether Leda dreamed it, lived it, or simply told it to a curious bard one lazy afternoon, the story remains soft, mysterious, and just a little bit feathery. Of course, once you open the scroll on Zeus's avian transformation, it becomes hard not to notice a pattern, or rather, a whole collection of them, because the goose, as curious as it is, was just one entry in a rather impressive lineup of divine disguises, each stranger than the last. You've already floated past the bull, the eagle, the suspiciously golden shower, but let's wade a little deeper into Zeus's mythological costume chest, shall we? For starters, there's the time he transformed into a flame, just to catch the attention of Aegina, who probably would have been impressed by a decent poem. Or how about when he turned into a cloud to visit Io? That one's poetic, sure, but also very moist. And then there's the truly questionable moment where Zeus transformed into Artemis, his own daughter's divine form, in order to get close to the nymph Callisto. It was, in every version, a bad idea. Hera, when she found out, was so furious she turned Callisto into a bear, which somehow solved nothing. So you see, the goose is one of Zeus's more restrained attempts. Historians still argue whether these transformations were always meant to represent literal events, or if they functioned as symbolic shorthand. Like Zeus became a bull might translate to Zeus acted with overwhelming power, or Zeus appeared as a cloud might mean confusion ensued, but also lightning. And then there's the question of why he kept doing it. Was it about disguise? Safety? Some divine code of conduct that frowned upon just showing up as yourself? Or was it simply theatrics? Because Zeus, for all his cosmic authority, was never subtle. He liked a good entrance, preferably with feathers, special lighting, and a possible thunderclap in the background. But the goose? The goose was different. There was no storm, no fanfare, no dramatic wind, just a bird, white and calm, gliding into a quiet garden where a queen was sitting with her thoughts. You can imagine how that felt. Not just strange, but intimate. A kind of divine approach that didn't demand fear, just attention. And maybe that's what makes this transformation linger. In most of Zeus's myths, the mood is grand and unsettling, but with Leda, there's stillness, a breath, a sense of something slipping gently into the world, and then away again. Later retellings would dress it up, add drama, suggest scandal, paint it with intensity. But the original versions, they're vague, purposefully so. As if even the storytellers were hesitant to pin down exactly what happened, or how. Some versions even suggest the entire myth is a cosmic metaphor for divine inspiration, a mortal touched briefly by something otherworldly, left changed but not destroyed. And that idea caught on. Artists across the centuries painted Leda and the goose again and again. The Renaissance loved it. Perhaps too much. They painted feathers, flowing robes, suggestive poses, and expressions that ranged from dreamy to confused. None of them agreed on where the moment began or ended. They just knew it mattered. Some paintings are serene, the goose resting in Leda's lap like a soft blessing. Others are more dramatic. Let's just say some frescoes have had to be carefully covered up in polite museums. And poets? Oh, the poets loved this story. They couldn't resist the symbolism, the elegance, the weirdness. They wrote verses about eggs and fate, about feathers and fire, about love in strange shapes. The Irish poet Whoopi Yeats even wrote Leda and the Swan, a dark, beautiful, and deeply unsettling poem that captures just how blurred the line between awe and violation can be in these old myths. But for tonight's purposes, let's return to the gentler version, the version where Zeus didn't swoop, didn't seize, didn't dazzle, the version where he simply became small, became soft, approached slowly, the version where Leda was set overpowered. She was chosen. Or maybe she chose. The myths don't agree, but the fact that they leave the door open, that's what makes it timeless. Because in a world of gods, in disguises, thunderbolts, and judgment, the idea of a quiet bird in a sunlit garden is somehow the most powerful image of all. At first glance, it seems minor. Bird is a bird, right? Wings, beak, dramatic entrance. But to the ancient Greeks, and to the poets, painters, and armchair mythologists that came later, the type of bird actually mattered. Yes, this question has kept translators, professors, and enthusiastic undergrads occupied for generations, scribbling notes in the margins of ancient texts and occasionally throwing olives at each other during symposia. Let's pause for a moment to address what may be the sleepiest scholarly debate in classical mythology. Was it a goose or a swan? But then we have geese. And here sits where things get feathery. In the earliest sources, Zeus is more often described as a swan, elegant, pristine, white as divine snow. Swans were associated with Apollo, poetry, and sacred beauty. They glide, they sing, they appear in frescoes wearing halos of sunlight. If you're going to choose a bird to seduce someone in a dream garden scenario, the swan is, admittedly, a strong contender. They were associated with fertility, vigilance, and domestic divinity, the kind of sacredness that doesn't roar from mountaintops, but watches the hearth, hisses at danger, and occasionally lays an egg with fate inside it. In many parts of Greece, especially rural regions, geese were more familiar. They weren't symbols of majesty so much as slightly grumpy pond guardians, loud, territorial, surprisingly effective at waking up the palace if someone wandered too close to the figs. But even so, geese carried symbolic weight. There's also the theory that the bird was never meant to be any one thing, just a shape, a symbol, something winged and white and strange that arrived unannounced. So which was it? Historians still argue. Some say the goose came from mistranslations. Ancient Greek terms like kaiknos, swan, and chen, goose, might have been mixed up. Others suggest the confusion is intentional, that the myth was told in different regions with different birds, depending on what people found more poetic. Swans for the city, geese for the countryside. In the other, Leda hears a faint honk. She turns to see a regal goose padding through the thyme bushes, chest puffed, feathers gleaming. It tilts its head, calm and utterly confident, like a creature who knows exactly what it's doing. But let's imagine both versions, shall we? In one, Leda kneels in her garden. A swan glides toward her, neck curved like a lyre's bow. Its wings shimmer. It barely touches the ground. Everything about it says this is a moment. Which is more divine? Which is more absurd? Which is more memorable? And perhaps that's why the myth has survived in both forms, because each version adds its own kind of magic. The answer, of course, depends on what kind of myth you want to fall asleep to. The swan makes for beautiful paintings. The goose makes for a better story. The swan brings grace. The goose brings a whisper of humor, of domestic weirdness, of something sacred sneaking into the everyday. Because that's the secret at the heart of all myths. The sacred isn't always grand. Sometimes it waddles in. Sometimes it honks. Sometimes it leaves behind a feather and doesn't explain itself. And thousands of years later, we're still lying here in the dark, wondering which bird it really was. Still waiting for the gods to appear in strange shapes. Still listening for wings. Still telling the story of all the unlikely plot twists in this already feathery myth. Perhaps the most charming is that Leda eventually got a temple. Yes, a whole temple, dedicated not just to Vesta or Hera or Athena, but to Leda herself, the mortal queen who raised a flock of semi-divine children, laid 2 eggs, and once received a visit from a suspiciously majestic bird. It wasn't the grandest temple in Greece. No golden domes or choral processions heard from across the sea, but it had columns, altars, and most tellingly, a mural featuring a woman beneath a tree and a very graceful goose beside her, tastefully ambiguous. Located in parts of Laconia and Sparta, these shrines were likely small, local offerings to a figure who lingered on the edge of divinity. People came to offer herbs, oils, small breads, and occasionally tiny carved birds made of ivory or clay. Some were swans, some were geese. A few looked more like duck pigeons, but the spirit was there. So why worship Leda? Well, it turns out that in Greek mythology, the boundary between mortal and sacred is often more of a curtain than a wall. Leda, as mother of Helen and the twins Castor and Pollux, had a divine resume, whether she asked for it or not. And like many mothers of heroes, she earned a kind of retroactive holiness. People prayed to her for fertility, marriage luck, and somewhat less predictably, good dreams. One tablet fragment, found near the Eurotas River, contains a worn inscription to Leda of the Garden. Grant me sleep without worry and love without confusion. A goose may have delivered her legend, but it was her quiet strength that secured her shrine. And here's the tender part. The temple was said to be peaceful, always, even during invasions or feuds, even when other temples were looted or repurposed. Leda's remained a place of calm. People went there not for spectacle, but for rest, reflection. One ancient traveler wrote of it. No thunder here, no roaring prophecy, just the hush of feathers and a woman who never raised her voice. That same traveler claimed the shrine had a garden of white roses, planted in rings, each with a feather at its center. Visitors would walk the path barefoot, lay a petal on the altar, and whisper their worries into the air. Was any of this historically verified? Not really. But do you believe it? Lying here now, in the dark? Of course you do. Because Leda, who never demanded glory, somehow became a symbol of grace under absurdity. A mortal who endured divine visitations, laid mythology's strangest breakfast, and raised children who sparked both wars and constellations. She didn't ask for any of it. And yet, she handled it all. So, yes, her temple may not have rivaled Delphi. Her name may not echo like Athena's, but she had a place, a quiet corner of the world that remembered her not for how loud her story was, but for how softly she lived it. And in that softness, she became something sacred, a goddess of the in between, of gardens and mothers and dreams shaped like birds. Meanwhile, back on Mount Olympus, the aftermath of the Goose incident continues to ripple, not loudly, not thunderously, but in the form of long silences, suspicious glances, and a growing pile of passive aggressive nectar pitchers on Zeus's side of the table. Because Hera knows, she always knows. She doesn't shout, doesn't hurl lightning. She simply rearranges her robes with precision, smiles in that way only immortal spouses can, and begins redistributing clouds over Sparta with increasing frequency. Zeus, for his part, does what he always does, pretends nothing happened. He lounges on his throne, strokes his beard, and loudly comments on weather patterns as if no one remembers the time he shapeshifted into a goose and flew off without explaining himself. The other gods, predictably, have opinions. Apollo is intrigued. He starts composing a quiet ballad about it, which he only plays after the third amphora of wine. Hermes finds the whole thing hilarious. He commissions a small figurine of Zeus as a goose wearing a crown. It becomes wildly popular among the divine attendants until Hera notices and it quietly disappears. Athena rolls her eyes and returns to her scrolls, muttering something about boundaries and dignity. And Aphrodite is delighted. She calls it one of the more graceful seductions Zeus has attempted in centuries and casually brings it up during divine salons just to watch Hera's jaw tighten by a millimeter. It's not that the gods are unfamiliar with Zeus's antics. By now, they've seen him fall in love with mortals, nymphs, clouds, and statues. But the goose form, that's a new texture. Even Hephaestus, who typically minds his forge and avoids gossip, raises an eyebrow when he hears about it. I mean, he says, a bull I can understand, but a goose, that sips a lot of wing. Still, what's striking is how unbothered Zeus seems. He doesn't gloat, doesn't visit Leda again, at least not in any of the surviving versions. It's as if, for once, he got what he came for and simply left it alone. No storms, no curses, no elaborate paternity disputes. Just a single act, one visit, two eggs, and the soft, lasting echo of something that, by godly standards, was practically gentle. Historians still wonder if Zeus actually felt something for Leda. Not just desire, not conquest, but something stranger for a god respect. She didn't beg, didn't fear, didn't chase. She simply sat, curious and calm, while a white feathered visitor glided into her life. And maybe, just maybe, that quietness stayed with him. Later, during the chaos of the Trojan War, sparked in no small part by Helen, one of those goose-born daughters, Zeus remains largely detached. He watches, occasionally nudges fate, but never intervenes with the passion he once showed for other mortal stories. It's as if he knows that this tale, the Leda tale, was already complete. No need to return, no need to explain. He gave her a visit. She gave the world legends, and the gods, well, they're still talking about it, in hushed voices, with smirks, with rolled eyes, but always with a touch of something else. Wonder, maybe, because, for all their power, the Olympians rarely manage a story so quiet, so strange, so featherlight. And when the stars shine above Olympus at night, some say Zeus looks toward the southern sky, where Castor and Pollux, his possible sons, glow in twin formation. And for a brief moment, he remembers a garden, a queen, and the sound of wings. If there's one thing Renaissance artists loved more than dramatic lighting and impossibly curly hair, it was mythology with just enough ambiguity to be considered respectable and just enough scandal to raise eyebrows discreetly in candlelight. Enter Leda and the Goose. For reasons that scholars pretend to analyze seriously and art historians reluctantly admit are partially aesthetic and partially sensational, this myth became a favorite subject for painters from the 14th to the 18th century. And not just favorite, obsessive. You could hardly swing a palette in Renaissance Florence without hitting someone working on a half-finished Leda and the Swan or Goose, depending on your interpretation, rendered in soft oils, with an expression that was either serene, startled, or gently confused. The most famous attempt came from none other than Leonardo da Vinci, who reportedly worked on a now lost painting of Leda standing beside the swan, delicately cradling two eggs as if they were Fabergé omelets. The painting itself vanished centuries ago, but we still have sketches and copies made by students and admirers who couldn't resist the strange magnetism of the scene. And those sketches, oh, they sear full of questions. Where exactly is Zeus the goose positioned? Why is Leda often painted looking directly at him with the emotional energy of someone waiting for a cryptic explanation? Why do the eggs sometimes appear already hatched, with chubby toddlers crawling across the grass? Art historians still argue whether these details were symbolic, romantic, or just a result of the artist getting halfway through the composition and muttering, you know what? Let's just go with it. Other artists were less subtle. In versions by Michelangelo, Correggio, and Cézanne, the goose is quite involved, draped, twisting, sometimes flapping in ways that seem biologically implausible. Leda, meanwhile, is rendered in silky, luminous poses, her expression hovering between divine ecstasy and is this tax deductible that one sculpture from the 16th century, allegedly displayed in a private villa, features a marble goose with wings fully outstretched and a Leda whose posture suggests that she is either dancing or politely requesting the goose back away. No one knows for sure. The plaque simply reads, Leda et avium divinum, Leda and the divine bird. Many of these works were later censored, covered, or simply lost to time. Too bold for public chapels, too strange for polite salons, and far too feathery for museums that preferred simpler nymphs and less poultry. But the fascination never faded, because this myth sits in that perfect artistic tension between beauty and absurdity, divinity and desire, clarity and confusion. It gives artists the excuse to paint elegance and enigma side by side, to blend feathers with flesh, and to leave just enough unsaid to keep viewers leaning in, eyes narrowed. Even today, versions of Leda and the Goose appear in modern galleries, reinterpretations in watercolor, sculpture, textile, and digital forms. Some are playful, some are uncomfortable. All are unmistakably part of a long tradition of trying to understand what exactly happened that day in the garden. Historians still argue if the myth is a metaphor for love, power, invasion, inspiration, or just a really weird dream. Artists, wisely, have mostly stopped trying to explain it at all. They just paint a queen, a bird, a mystery. And maybe that sips enough, because some myths are instead meant to be solved. They're meant to be looked at, quietly, curiously, maybe with a cup of tea, and a faint sense that something divine just waddled into the room and left without knocking. Somewhere between myth and metaphor, between feathers and philosophy, the story of Leda and the goose settled into the hearts of poets, and once it got there, it never left. Because if painters adored the soft curves and dramatic light, poets loved the puzzle, the unsettling elegance, the dream logic imagery, the sense that something deeply intimate and deeply strange had occurred, and no one could quite say what it meant. And so they wrote, centuries of them. Roman poets started it, of course, with references in soft elegies and ironic epigrams. Ovid, ever the master of the elegantly inappropriate, alludes to Leda's encounter in passing, as if he's trying not to smirk while reciting it aloud in the forum. Later, the medievals mostly left her alone, too feathered, too confusing, not nearly pious enough for their tastes. But once the Renaissance came swinging back, with its love of classical obscurity and light scandal, Leda returned, this time swathed in stanzas, and with her came metaphors. So many metaphors. The goose, or swan, became a stand-in for divine passion, unwelcome fate, or occasionally the unknowable nature of inspiration. Leda was variously cast as an unwilling vessel, a visionary touched by the cosmos, or a serene figure whose stillness masked world-breaking consequence. Poets wrote of her hair as river water, of her eyes reflecting sky, of the moment of encounter as something outside time, a feather's fall into eternity, as one particularly dreamy Greek revivalist put it. But the most famous of them all, O.V. Yeats. His poem Leda and the Swan, published in 1923, is as haunting as it is beautiful. It captures the moment of encounter, not as a peaceful garden rendezvous, but as a violent, sweeping upheaval of power, fate, and prophecy. There is no gentle bird here. The imagery is raw, muscular, almost brutal. A sudden blow, the great wings beating still. Yeats wasn't interested in the feathers or the eggs. He saw the myth as the beginning of everything, the birth of Helen, the fall of Troy, the end of one world, and the start of another. His Leda doesn't choose. She simply receives. The poem ends not with understanding, but with a question. Did she put on his knowledge with his power? Before the indifferent beak could let her drop. Chilling. Yes. And entirely at odds with the soft, sleepy version we've been exploring. Not necessarily. Because myths live in layers. Some are loud and sharp, some are soft and slow, some end in prophecy, others in poetry, others in silence. For every Yeats, there's a counterpoint, some quiet voice in a lesser known scroll, describing Leda simply walking through her garden, finding peace and stillness, touched by something she cannot explain, and continuing on, not as victim, not as legend, but as woman, as queen, as someone who knows how to hold a moment without needing to solve it. Poets, of course, keep trying. They write sonnets about feathers, haikus about eggs. One modern piece described the entire myth as a feather between heartbeats, which is lovely, but maybe unnecessary, because Ladysip's story doesn't demand poetry. It is poetry, feathered, unfinished, whispering just enough to stay with you, long after the candle's out and the lines have ended. And now we arrive at the edge of the myth, where feathers have settled, eggs have hatched, and the world has gone on spinning, half forgetting the very moment that sent it wobbling in a new direction. Because that's the strange power of stories like this. They begin with a quiet, bizarre detail, like a goose in a garden, and ripple outward until entire wars, constellations, and paintings owe their existence to one unassuming afternoon. And so, before we drift off entirely, let's ask the coziest of mythological questions. Was there a moral to all of this? Was the tale of Zeus and Leda meant to teach something? Warn someone? Inspire a new form of bird-based caution in royal gardens? The answer is maybe. Some versions lean into destiny, that from strange unions come powerful children, and that fate doesn't always walk. It glides in on wings, softly, unannounced. Others find a tale of choice, that Leda, unlike so many figures in Greek myth, holds a measure of agency, depending on the telling. She receives the visitor. She keeps her silence. She raises the children and never names the bird. A few even read it as a metaphor for creativity itself. That moment when something unexpected arrives in your quietest hour, leaves behind an idea or an egg, and disappears, never explaining where it came from or why it chose you. Historians, predictably, remain divided. Some dismiss it as symbolic pageantry. Others call it psychological allegory. A brave few propose it's simply a very old joke that no one wanted to admit was still in circulation. But maybe, just maybe, it was never about the gods or the eggs or the exact taxonomic classification of the bird. Maybe it was always about Leda, a mortal woman, a queen, someone who lived a quiet life, tended her garden, and in a single moment found herself caught in a divine mystery and remained calm. She didn't panic. She didn't proclaim. She didn't chase the myth down and demand it explain itself. She simply lived, raised her children, accepted the ambiguity, and let the story do the flapping. There's something oddly peaceful about that. Because in a world that's always trying to pin things down, label them, decode them, argue about bird wingspan, Leda's myth offers the gentlest kind of resistance. It simply exists. Not for solving, not for proving, but for remembering. A queen, a bird, a sky that held its breath. And now, as our telling folds its wings and the story nestles into sleep, you carry that softness with you. You've walked in the garden. You've seen the feather fall. You've heard the gods bicker, the scholars quibble, the poets dream. And now, there sits nothing left to do but rest. There was no thunder, no decree, just a moment, a brush of wings, a ripple that grew quiet. You've traveled through the folds of a story spun in feather and moonlight. You've watched a queen receive the strangest of visitors, raise legendary children, and become myth by simply continuing on. Let your breath soften now. Let your thoughts drift. Light us down. All you need to carry is the stillness, the grace, the strange, sleepy courage of letting something absurd visit you and choosing not to fight it. Let that quiet settle in your chest now. Let it fill the spaces between your thoughts, the hush of the temple, the stillness of the shrine, the way the stars watched without blinking. You don't have to carry the details, not the eggs, not the lineage, not the scholarly debates about waterfowl taxonomy. All of that can stay here, folded in story. You are not required to understand the goose or the gods or even the story. Just rest inside it, like Leda beneath the fig tree. Let the stars hum above you. Let the breeze carry what sips left. And let sleep come, soft, slow, and quiet as feathers falling into myth